The house on the cul-de-sac wore Christmas like a favorite sweater, slightly stretched, impossibly warm, and the kind of cozy no one outside could buy. Wreaths leaned on front doors. Icicle lights winked like constellations gone domestic. The smell of cinnamon and something buttery threaded through the rooms. A plastic Santa, slightly leaning from his long and illustrious career guarding cookie jars, presided over the kitchen island like an exhausted but beloved umpire. Kelly opened the back door to the yard and felt the hush of early morning like it was the first page of a book. The sky was platinum, the kind that turns street lights into soft halos. A last string of frost clung to the lawn, and she could see the breath of her teenage son, puffing and then disappearing like little ghosts. Inside, the house was breathing in its own way. The hum of the refrigerator, the dishwasher's muffled shrug, the living room tree whispering needles. Across the hall, paper chains from last week's craft party sagged and looped like careful, colorful promises. Presents were stacked like small, secret buildings, tags teased with partial names. Tell, from Michael, from Santa, or someone equally sneaky. Kelly tilted her head and smiled. It was, on the surface, every family Christmas she'd had, a tangle of chaos and joy. But today, she carried a small, bright plan in her pocket, folded like a note you keep because the paper itself seems to glow. It wasn't something she'd rehearsed on television or sketched in a memo. This was private. The idea had arrived at her in a way she sometimes got her best impulses, while making coffee, mid-sentence on the phone with a producer, watching a dog who had just discovered the neighbor's hedgehog-shaped yard ornament. It felt necessary and a little reckless. It felt like a holiday. She had told no one. Not Mark, not the kids, not even her assistant Lydia, who was the kind of person who would text you in the middle of a lull and ask whether you wanted cinnamon or nutmeg in your latte. Secrets at home are rare. Gifts are coordinated weeks in advance. School plays are posted on calendars with surgical precision. That's the thing about families who share their lives with millions. Public scheduling can translate into private predictability. So when Kelly decided to be silent for 4 hours that Christmas morning, the only person who knew about the silence was the woman herself. Why silence? Because she wanted to listen. She'd been listening all her life, to producers, to script notes shoved into her palm during commercial breaks, to co-hosts and guests who wanted to be heard. Listening on television is a practiced economy. You nod, you smile, you make others feel big enough to fill the screen, and you move things along. But listening at home is different. It's not about volume or ratings. It's about the particular, tender noises of people learning who they are. It was about letting her children speak and be heard without the habit of her corrections, solutions, or the habit of stepping in because the word was missing or the malady obvious to a mother's practiced eye. She imagined the way silence could work like an invitation, the kind you hand someone with a plate of cookies and say, "Tell me the thing." She wanted them to tell her the thing. She took a breath, made herself a cup of coffee, extra hot, black, because silence deserves warmth, and slid a small note onto the kitchen island. It was cut from a note card, decorated with reindeer wearing tiny scarves. "Do not speak to me," it read, as plain as a command and as soft as a bedtime story. Below, in a smaller script, she wrote, "Don't panic. 4 hours. Listen. No answers. No interruptions. Treat me like Santa's silent elf." Then she left the room, leaving the note where her kids' hands would find it. Lola saw the card first. She was the one who habitually woke last, because teenagers hold sleep like a tiny, private treasure. She padded into the kitchen with thick socks and hair in a lopsided bun, eyes still sand-blown from sleep. She took one look at the card, and because Lola had the reflexes of someone who'd been raised on improvisation and family lore, she laughed, loud enough to rattle the ornament on the tree. Michael looked. She waved the card like a flag. "Mom's doing a silent retreat." Michael came in, hair mussed and wearing socks that did not match. Their youngest, who was not strictly a child anymore, took the note, read it, and did what every sibling in the world does in this situation. He tested the rule. "Ma," he called, because you have to check boundaries, even when they're written in glittered stationery. Kelly, walking from the pantry with a platter of cinnamon rolls, smiled and lifted both hands in a show of surrender. No speaking. She mimed silence with an exaggerated finger to her lips and a raised eyebrow that said, "This is serious and silly at once." The kids, delighted by the performance, decided to play along. Their laughter was noisy, and she held her breath, letting the sound thread around her like beads on a string. The house morphed around this new rule. The television, which on holiday defaults to a benign snowstorm of classic cartoons and holiday movies, became an unintentional accent of background noise. Phones buzzed in other rooms. The dog, unimpressed by human practices, barked a couple of salty, indignant barks. Mark, finding the note half a beat later, with the way of men entering a kitchen who assume all things domestic must be understood in a single glance, raised a conspiratorial eyebrow. He looked at Kelly, who only smiled and did the silence gesture again. "You can talk now," he mouthed, and she shook her head. He shrugged and kissed the top of her head. Then he left the room to check the oven like a man who had always been in charge of the flame. He respected the note because, in their house, they practiced rules the way people practice faith, with devotion and sometimes with mischief. So they began. Lola brought out the old box of ornaments from the attic, the one with the tissue paper that made an inland sea of rustle. Michael disappeared into his room and returned with a heavy, dog-eared board game. They set it up and started to play without calling out moves, because silence forces gestures, and gestures are like secret languages that are all the more adorable because their meanings spill out slowly. Kelly watched them. She watched as Lola's face softened when she reattached a fragile glass angel to the tree, and as her hands trembled just slightly as she smoothed tinsel around its wings. She watched Michael wrestle with pawns like they were difficult conversations. She watched the smallest, most human things. The way Michael chewed his lip when he concentrated. The way Lola rolled her eyes dramatically when she lost a tower in the game. She thought about the last year, the way life ran like a script. Appointments, appearances, the steady hum of outside expectations trying to translate into inside choices. Being listened to, really listened to, is a kind of oxygen. She had talked into microphones, into rooms of people, into televisions. She'd been the one people expected to deliver jokes and empathy in equal measure. But how often had she been the one who simply sat still and let things come? A knock at the door jarred her attention. Lydia, hands full of last-minute wrapping paper, grinned and mouthed something frantic. Kelly's smile softened, and she pointed at the note, then to her throat, then to 4 fingers held up like the count on a referee's card. Lydia laughed and nodded, tiptoeing around domestic sacredness as if it were a sleeping cat. Time became a playful enemy. She watched the clock and then stopped watching the clock. The first hour was a gentle novelty, like discovering a new song. They ate cinnamon rolls without commentary, and she noticed things about the kids that television never revealed. The scratch on Michael's knuckle from where he'd been fixing a bike chain, the tiny pastel pen marks on Lola's wrist where she'd been doodling during a long class. She learned the sound of Michael's laughter when he tried, silently, to do a dramatic monologue with his mouth pressed into a ridiculous circle, the kind of thing that, when done in the quiet of a family room, sounds like an old sketch resurfacing. The second hour grew more thoughtful. Kelly made cocoa and placed a mug in front of each person. She watched them take sips and noticed how Mark's eyes narrowed when something bothered him and how, without words, he found ways to say it. A hand on Kelly's shoulder, a look that carried the weight of a conversation they could have had in a sentence. The silence allowed new conversations to begin in small spaces. Lola tracing the rim of her mug and, with exaggerated gestures, showing her brother the bracelet she wanted to make. Michael, through a series of mime-like gestures, recreated a hockey play from last week that had gone amusingly wrong. Their dog decided to lay across all the legs of the coffee table in protest and shed snowflakes of fur like confetti. There were moments of unease. Once, Lola glanced at Kelly, and her mouth opened as if she had a question that tasted big and dangerous. She froze, then chose to write something on the back of a receipt and push it across the table. "Do you miss the old house?" The letters were neat, with teenage precision. Kelly's throat hummed with 1,000 answers, the first being the small personal shriek of someone who misses a place even if they love the place they now had. She picked up a pen, wrote sometimes and slid it back, because silence isn't about taking away comfort. It's about giving room for feelings that need small, contained spaces to unravel. Time, in the silence, felt elastic. The hours folded and refold. The third hour was a slow, kind of sacred thing. They told stories in gestures and notes. Mark, who had a habit of being both jokester and steady anchor, stood up and, without speaking, began to write on a large pad. "The best present I ever got was the one I didn't know I needed." He tapped the pad with a pen like the drumbeat of a storyteller, then began to sketch messy, exaggerated drawings of all the Christmases they'd shared. A tent made of sheets, a misfit lamp picked up on the side of the road, a chair that was replaced with a better one after 1,000 small repairs. It was an illustrated testament to the idea that presents are often not things but rearranged moments. Lola, in turn, produced a crumpled piece of sheet music, and with a flourish that was theater without words, cued Michael to play the piano. He did, with a sort of clumsy, earnest few chords that signal someone still learning the edges of their craft. Kelly felt a bloom like warmth from the inside out. Watching her children find their language without her speaking made her feel like a midwife to their small, private self-assemblies.